Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. We're going to be talking a lot about emotion today, which is great. I had a wonderful day to kind of set up this conversation in that so many things went wrong. My wonderful guest has been so patient. We had some technical difficulties. He went from his house into the university to tried a bunch of different headphones, oh my goodness, guys! It's been an ordeal. It hasn't been. There's bigger things in life to worry about for sure, but there's just been a series of inconveniences today. It started with, as I was already running late, I got locked in my bathroom. This is a thing I already shared with Nicholas, but I'm raising awareness for this new issue that it was never on my radar before. What you want to do is maybe keep a screwdriver under your sink in case the handle or the lock mechanism on your bathroom handle just breaks and it turns and it doesn't open. Fortunately, I was on the ground floor, was able to crawl out my bathroom window, get a screwdriver, crawl back in, and that's how it started. And then this was like hours ago, and then Nicholas and I have been dealing with tech issues and all of these other things, and I'm so fortunate to have such a wonderfully patient guest with me today. So please welcome, all the way from Standford University, Nicholas Coles, everybody. Woo! Thanks for joining me, Nicholas.
Thanks, Shane.
This is, again, we also recorded for a few minutes and then had issues come up. Then there's subways going by your or trains going by your apartment. Wow, it's been a real emotional roller coaster.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, Shane. You know, we had some fear, we had some frustration and anger, some, feelings of triumph and excitement when we finally could get it to work. So an emotional day indeed.
Yeah. This is it really set things up quite nicely, especially for it's. I want to let you set up what you do and some of the basics of your background and research first. But there's definitely specifics of some of your research that I've already been thinking about as all of this has been going on over the last couple hours. So why don't you introduce yourself to the good listeners?
Yeah. So I'm Nicholas Coles. I am a research scientist at Standford University, previously a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University, and before that was a PhD student at the University of Tennessee working with Dr. Jeff Larson, who has also been on this show many times. And of course, my greatest accolade so far is actually being on this podcast. So thank you for inviting me, Shane.
Well, you have a low bar for accolades then. But yeah, thanks for joining me. Yeah, Jeff is awesome. He has a poker night every other Saturday that I'm sometimes able to make time to attend, and it's a lot of fun. And everyone that Jeff has recommended for me has been fantastic. And I looked at your work and see it looks really cool. So talk about maybe a little bit. This is such an interesting topic to me, whereas I imagine it's interesting to everybody. Normally, if I have a guest on, it's like, what got you interested in learning about algae? How did you get into that? But this is the researching emotion it's just like, who wouldn't be interested in that? But what was your path? How did you decide on the field?
Oh man, there's like so many things that I think that happened that sort of led to this. But I think, when I try to think back as far as I can, I remember sort of being in my early science classes as like, I don't know, 7-year-old, and learning about the senses of touch and hearing and taste. And I remember, having this sort of thought experiment posed by one of my teachers where they said, well, if there's any sense that you feel like you could like not live without, like, what would it be? And I remember at the time telling them, like, it'd be my sense to feel emotion. And of course, my science teacher, scolded me and said, well, that's not a sense. We're talking about taste and hearing, and emotion isn't a sense. But at the time, there was this profound feeling of, yes, it is. And the fact that I became so angry at this teacher suggested to me that this is a very powerful thing that we feel, but wasn't being discussed, at least in the elementary school science classes. And so I became really interested in this. I said, this seems to me to be the most profound feeling that we can experience, and I wanted to know everything about it. And so I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure out what it is, what is emotional experience, and then also because of that, I'm just interested in anything that has to do with emotion in general. And so I'm very interested in like group-based differences in emotion inequality, anything that has to do with the study of emotion. I'm quite interested in, just so I can prove that teacher wrong.
That is fantastic. Can you repeat again? You said group-based. What were the two things that you just mentioned? Group-based.
Differences in emotion. I'm really interested in how the emotional lives of people can vary. And you could think of any group. So you could imagine how the emotional reality that we occupy could have hypothetically been different if we were raised in East Asia, for instance. So I'm very interested in cross-cultural differences in the types of emotions that we value, the types of emotions that we typically experience. But you could even imagine within culture that there might be certain groups that, for instance, might experience more anger than others. There might be certain groups where they're discouraged from expressing that anger. And so to me, those are all really interesting questions that are beyond my initial interest in like just knowing what emotional experience is. This is sort of like a broadening of that interest for me, where I'm also just interested in the emotional realities that we occupy, understanding what that is and how it can differ from person to person.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I find often when I find myself thinking about emotion, my starting point is from kind of an evolutionary perspective of why do we have these things in the first place? What is the utility? What is this emotion driving a given organism or humans to do in different contexts? But there is so many environmental and I guess I'd never really thought too much about the cultural differences before, but it's pretty widely understood that certain cultures are more serious than others. Some are more playful. Some are more individualistic or collectivist. There's so many different environments that like the emotions that you can express during whatever sport you're playing are maybe very different than the emotions that are socially acceptable or encouraged in an office setting, and this is that's changing pretty wildly all the time. That's interesting, because going back to the physical senses, there's the age-old philosophical question of, does the sky look the same color of blue to everybody or whatever? But and of course the answer is yes. But with emotion, I'm kidding. I don't exactly know that answer.
I don't either.
I would guess that there's a lot higher correlation between how colors are experienced than how the emotional lives that we live within are experienced. I would think that there's a lot more variance within our emotional lives than interpreting a specific color.
Yeah. There's a lot of thoughts that I have about this, of course, but to talk very briefly about these cross-cultural differences in emotion. Jeannie Tsai is a psychologist here at Stanford who's studied this way more than I have. So everything I know about it is because I've read her work and just been really excited about it. But one of her papers looked at differences in the emotions conveyed in grieving cards, and compared specifically grieving cards in Germany versus the US. And so to clarify, when I mean grieving card, like a card that you send someone after they've experienced a death of a relative or a friend. And what they found is that the emotional messages that you commonly see in those greeting cards wildly differs across those cultures. And so in the US, we often want to put this like positive bend on death. And we say something like, oh, like, be happy that it happened. Like, like cherish the memories you had with this person. Be thankful for the time that you had with them, or like wounds will heal with time. And apparently the grieving cards in Germany are more so like, there's nothing you can do to overcome this sadness. Just like a greeting.
I love that.
Yeah, like that a little card.
Feels more. I don't know how much of this, because this is, I should say this up front because I think it's going to come into play during our conversation. I don't know how much of this is my own sort of knee-jerk kind of contrarian default mode that I have, where I don't exactly know what caused all of this or why I am this way, but I grew up in the Midwest, a suburb in Wisconsin, and it was my experience of growing up was a very like Pleasantville, like a forced kind of cheerfulness, and everyone was like a collective wholesomeness that everyone's supposed to be sharing and expressing all of the time, and it always felt a little disingenuous to me. So I think that I sometimes err in bias in kind of a distrust of some of the light, like forced positivity, motivational speaking, pep talky sort of thing. So I actually relate more to those German cards than that. Like that feels real to me. Like that feels honest, But maybe that might just be a part of my default contrarian reaction to my upbringing, whereas if I would have been raised in Germany, maybe I'd be like, God, stop being so grumpy all the time. There's positive ways to reframe this.
Yeah. So I was a visiting research fellow at the Eindhoven University of Technology a few years ago. And so if you're not familiar with that, it's like located in a city called Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And one of the first things that I learned was that there was just massive, this is an anecdote, of course, but I think there's something to it, that there's massive differences in the sort of expected, they call them display rules of emotion in the Netherlands versus the US. And smiling for no reason whatsoever in the Netherlands was considered very strange. And I remember I was... Yeah.
What?
Yeah, like
can we pause on that for a moment? Like, let's take all that in. This is wow. I already wanted to visit the Netherlands, and there's so many positive things said about it all of the time. From afar, it seems like it's a very scientifically oriented culture, and it seems like there's just there's a ton of great work that comes out of there and everything, and it seems like they're what is it, like the happiness quotient or whatever the term for the thing, where the kind of when they try to measure basic
gross national happiness.
gross national, yeah, instead of domestic product. It seems like they're always really high on that scale. And so that's shocking for me to hear that smiling is an abnormal thing there.
Well, like smiling for no reason. And so,
smiling for,
yeah.
okay.
So
Okay.
I think we're very smile happy in the US. And, for instance, when I don't know, like if I was just walking onto a train and I was going to sit next to someone, I would probably give them sort of like an affiliated smile, like, hey, like
Yes.
glad to be coexisting in this world with you. And that just seemed a little bit, more strange when I was there. And I was attending a research talk, and granted, it wasn't a very good research talk. And so I raised my hand to like say something. I'm like, oh, this is like really interesting, good research, but I have these few critiques. And the person who I was studying under said, like, if an American says that your research is like interesting and good, that's the Dutch equivalent of saying that this is utter trash. And so they sort of had this intuitive sense that there was like this cultural filter where, people in the US, this was their impression, people in the US were like very optimistic, very smiley, very polite. Whereas, I was sort of told that in the Netherlands, they really value being blunt and direct and genuine and like how you express your feelings to one another. And so it's an anecdote, of course, but it really was my lived experience when I was there.
Man, I love that. I mean, I'm on team genuine. I think that yeah, I guess some of the forced, I love the idea of emotional displays because I often think about that quite a bit with there's this really good RSA animate video by, I think her name's Rachel Maines, and the title is Smile or Die. And it was like I've never had my beliefs on this subject summed up so well in just like a 8 to 10 minute video. But it does, there's something creepy about this social, like being forced to kind of put on a face, being forced to be a cheerleader around the office, and actually in that video she even speculates on part of the there's this good documentary, Maxed Out, that what's her name? The politician, she was running for president at Harvard. Why am I forgetting her name? I like her. Oh shoot.
I don't know either.
Trump always makes fun of her. Oh man. I'm hold on a second.
Wait, is it Elizabeth Warren? Was she at Harvard?
Elizabeth Warren.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically there was, before the 2008 financial crisis, she was asked to give speeches about risk mitigation for banks and stuff, and she looked at the evidence and would present a case of like, I think you guys are lending to people that aren't showing an ability to pay back these loans. And basically over and over again, she was told like, well, that was interesting, but we like to keep things positive around here. And that's, so I use that as an example of just the potential downsides of large scale, like mandatory positivity that it seems like are that maybe because I live in the US, but it seems like it leads to a fair amount of prideful ignorance in the US. And I believe that there's a lot of value in believing in yourself and feeling driven and all of that. But I've always taken issue with some of the we always, of course, we all want to be happy, but we want to choose to be happy. We don't want to feel forced to put on a face of happiness all of the time.
And there's this really interesting sort of like intersection with gender here as well. And so there's this really fascinating literature on what they call emotion labor, which is, essentially this idea that labor is more than just sort of like physically lifting things and like engaging in intellectual tasks. Like managing our emotions is a form of labor, and in certain areas of the job sector, you have to do it more often. And so think about like I used to work at a theme park, and when I worked at a theme park, I had to engage in a lot of emotion labor, and I actually got sort of scolded at one point because I was told I didn't look happy enough. And which is like such a weird thing to get scolded for, but that's called emotion labor, and there's some a really great literature on it, and it there's sort of differences in the types of emotion labor that people have to perform, and there's also differences in the types of emotions that people are allowed to express. And so in this literature, they often will describe how women can be penalized for expressing anger that men aren't like as penalized for. And the inverse is like men being penalized for crying. Typically expressing a lot of sadness when it comes with tears is sort of like a socially unacceptable expression for men in the US. There are exceptions though. You are allowed to cry like when you win the Super Bowl. So like when you like come, when you have this great triumph.
And that's it.
Yeah. So Shane, when I cried when we finally got the microphone to work, that was a socially acceptable form of crying.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's like an interesting part of it as well. Is like there's also a really great book by Davin Phoenix called The Anger Gap, where he's a sociologist and he sort of explores this idea that in the U.S. Black Americans don't have the same liberty to express anger as white Americans do. And he talks about all of like the implications this has for things like protesting and engaging in politics. And so those are the sorts of things that like I'm very interested in. I'm still very much at the stage where I'm learning a lot about it. I've been sort of focused on emotion experience for a long time, and not as much about like group-based differences in emotion. But it's something that really fascinates me, and I think it's sort of like the next step that I hope to take.
That's sort of there's a lot of speculation, or maybe not even maybe research as well, in terms of females not being able to or not being as socially acceptable to express anger in, say, the workplace or whatever, whereas the boss does it and it's like that's how you lead, that's how you be dominant, and then a female does it and the female boss is like bitchy or whatever, has these labels attached to that same experience. Yeah, the crying as a man thing is like, that's because I wish that I cried more often than I do. When I do, I'm always like, yes, finally, because it doesn't happen that much. But during movies, I really like a beautiful, when there's some twist or something. It doesn't need to be like sad or just something really clever, like The Usual Suspects or something like that, where I'm just like, I'm appreciating the art of like, oh, that got me, and I'll tear up a little bit, but I often, that's the common thing to like, you tear up, you're experiencing like tears of joy, and you're like hiding them from the people around it, like, oh geez, I hope someone doesn't see me expressing joy in this particular way. Yeah.
We're gonna have I want to let your listeners know, Shane and I are gonna have a really nice cry session today in this chat. So stay tuned. And Shane, I also want to point out, like, just like how beautiful it is to experience emotion. Like just like that people think of being like foodies, but not emotionies. I made up that word, emotionies. But for me, there's nothing so beautiful as like a really like just being really surprised by something and sort of sitting there and in a very sort of conscious and mindful way, thinking about how that feeling feels for you. And same with sadness. I wish that, we could, I guess this is like what a movie theater is, but it would be interesting to like go to a place where you go there to experience emotions. And I find all emotions to be sort of interesting to experience.
Yes.
I don't like sadness is more beautiful to me these days than it was at like other points in my life. And I don't know. So I sort of encourage listeners, like, if you're interested in emotion, like really think about how it makes you feel. And like, it is like a very interesting phenomenon, similar to like touching like a nice scarf or listening to a beautiful song. The emotions you experience are like equally beautiful, like, I don't know, aesthetics.
Yeah. And that's, and that is sort of a way of, positive reframing that actually does seem to work for me, or that I buy into, that seems to add value to my life, where I've been meditating more again recently. I go in streaks where I fall out of it for months or more at a time. And I'm back on a meditation kick. And when I do, I'm just tuned in. I'm just a little more mindful to those things. But even things like thinking about, COVID or global warming or mass extinction or something like that. I'll be thinking about, some huge existential, the almost hopeless feeling of how the human condition can feel sometimes, and all of the suffering that is experienced on Earth. And I think the intuition, or at least some of the social pressure, at least in the US, is to kind of ignore or distract yourself from thoughts or feelings like that, or seek ways to resolve those things. Whereas I think some of those most kind of, in quotes, negative emotions, those are some of the ones that have the sort of, from an emotional palette point of view, it has like a richer kind of feeling to it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Describe it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's like I've shared this before on the show, where I don't experience loneliness that much, or at least not on the conscious level. Maybe I do just as much as everybody else, but I guess I'm not as mindful of it. I've spent quite a bit of time alone. Well, I was traveling for like 17 years, and you're by yourself like quite a bit. And then I have like a huge, I'm performing in front of a crowd and meet a zillion people afterwards. It's like a little overwhelming. If anything, I kind of prefer the alone time. But once in a while, I'll just get this wave of loneliness, and it's I almost get excited because I don't experience, it's kind of novel when it happens. It's kind of like I don't know, it's kind of like tasting something bitter or something, where on the surface it seems like, oh well, why would I eat something bitter? But it's like, oh, actually in certain dishes it adds a really nice value and flavor to the experience.
Yeah.
Thoughts, questions, concerns?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. My first one is like, I thought we were getting so close to Shane crying on his podcast, and it didn't happen there. So
it's not going to happen, because I wish that it would. It would be great. It would make for such good podcasting. It's just I can't. Do you ever try to cry? Sometimes I try to cry. Like, I'm like, ooh, is this a cry coming on? And I'll try to cry. It just never works for me. It just never. I cry like once a year, and I have to cherish that experience for what it is, because I just can't. It just won't come out other than that. I know a lot of people that cry way more often than they like to. So that's a different problem. And I don't relate to or have experience with, that I'm sure could be potentially worse in certain instances. But But yeah, if you get a cry out of me today, I'm gonna be thrilled. You're gonna win a prize.
Yeah, it's for me, the one thing that can like just always consistently make me cry is the opening scene from the movie Up. I don't know if you.
Oh, I should watch that movie. Everyone says that's a good one.
So the opening scene is just utterly, utterly tragic. And we use it in emotion research a lot to get people to feel sad and to get people to cry. And, a lot of times we have these videos that we use, and I watch them, I'm like, okay, this doesn't really age that well, or I've seen it a few times and it's not really that effective anymore. And then you worry that maybe it won't work in your study. That opening scene from Up, in my opinion, is one of the most beautifully crafted emotion elicitators that I've ever encountered in my life. And I've watched it dozens of times because I keep using it in my studies, and I cry every single time.
Really? All right. I'm in. I'm sold. I'm sold.
Shane, I'm going to email you the link to it.
I can't wait.
I'm going to email the link, and we should record like a reaction video of us watching this for your viewers, so that they can humanize you and know that Shane experiences emotion too.
Yeah, we could do that. People that listen to this show know that I experience so much emotion that I just can't stop blabbing about it. Maybe that's not true. I'm also, it's weird because I think that I think it just comes along with being a comedian, where we get rewarded for kind of being vulnerable and sharing things that are maybe not as the sort of things that you don't necessarily express around the cubicle or whatever. And I mean, there's different styles. There's like tough guy, like, hey, this guy's shirt's stupid in the front row, and like that's just not my style. And then there's people that explore their like there's a special Nanette that made some waves a few years ago, where it's just being like very, very vulnerable. Or there's this show One Mississippi with Tig Notaro on Amazon Prime that I just watched recently. That's fantastic. She got her breast removed because of cancer, and also she had been like molested in her upbringing, and her like mom died, and like all of these things like came to a head all at once, and she expressed this stuff on stage one day, and anyway, it ended up being made into this very amazing TV show that's very honest and genuine and thoughtful and funny, and it's fantastic. But I think that if anything, there's incentive for me to be more open about articulating kind of some of my inner experiences. And I think that I'm sort of privileged in that way, because then that's the other thing too with like social displays, where it's in the same way that some people are meant to be like cheerleaders around the office. As a comedian, you're meant to be like really vulnerable, or you get rewarded. You just notice it after a while. You share something about having a bad day or whatever, and it gets this really big laugh, and like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, what else could I dig into? But then it's almost you start mining a little too hard after a while, whereas like a subtle passing emotion, you're like, ooh, let me latch onto that one and like dig into that and try to express that a little more. So I almost have the kind of opposite effect going on, but it's interesting. I'm also really interested in kind of the idea of self-deception having social utility, whereas it's easier to convince others of a thing if you believe it yourself. And I think that there's stuff going on with emotion as well. So in some ways, I don't know if my overexpression of emotion is any more genuine than being a cheerleader around the office, just because I'm just in a different social environment than someone in a cubicle. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. in the sense that when people think of display rules, they often want to think about it as this, thing that pervades all situations. And so like, they have this idea like men can't cry. And that's not true because, as we see, like you can cry when you win the Super Bowl and not be too penalized about it, but you can't cry if you mess up a pass. So I think what you're sort of articulating here, Shane, is like there's certain professions where it seems to be more socially acceptable to display emotions. And so being a comedian being one of them, where people, like it when you go on stage and you express this very, raw emotion. But yeah, maybe not so good in the workplace if I just like sat down in the middle of a meeting and said something really dark, like we're all going to die. Eventually this is all pointless. Like, oh wait, hold on. That's not the point of today's meeting. So, just some quick thoughts on that. But Shane, I have thought a lot about this idea of like posed, like fake poses of emotion, as like that's been a lot of my research on what that does to our actual emotions when we fake a smile. Does that actually make us feel happier?
I read just a little bit about this, and I'm so excited to talk to you about this because you're possibly debunking one of my favorite studies to reference, which is, it always happens every time a study is just a little too fun. A good rule of thumb is like, oh, that's probably not going to age very well. It's probably not going to replicate very well. There's probably going to be some complexity and nuance discovered down the line with that. And maybe you can share it for us, but the pencil in the mouth study is one that I've shared. I'm sure I butchered it in the past too. So I don't know if you want to start there, but I love this subject.
Yeah. So Shane, I'm going to take like a minute to explain the theory a little bit as well.
Yeah. Which
I hope your listeners won't hate, but if they do, I encourage them to, sit with that emotion for a minute. So this, my interest in the effects of posed facial expressions on emotions stemmed from my interest in figuring out what it is that an emotion is. And one of the theories that I find really intriguing was originally proposed, well, I guess popularized by William James in 1888. And William James was like sort of a philosopher / psychologist at Harvard University. And he sort of posited that emotional experience is just sensations from the peripheral nervous system, so the body. And so when we say we're experiencing an emotion, what we're doing is we're articulating that we can sense that our heart rate is elevated and that our blood pressure has changed and that there's all of these sort of changes in this bottom part of the body, like below the head, that we can sense because we have things like proprioception and interoception. And so we notice this physiological change. And William James said, like, that's the emotion. Before then, people sort of thought that like emotion was something that was sort of disembodied. And then it happened, and all of this stuff happened in your body as a byproduct. But that was just a byproduct. It was sort of, had a bunch of different other implications, but that wasn't emotional experience. And William James said, no. It's that physiological feeling is emotional experience. And so that's sort of been my theoretical grounding, is that, it's those interoceptive, proprioceptive changes in our body that we sense. And that's what gives like us emotional feeling. Hold on. Yeah.
What were those words? I'm so excited. If I just learned. I learned a new thing.
Interoception is your ability to detect changes in things like heart rate and blood pressure. So if you go on a long run, you might notice that your heart rate is accelerated, and your ability to detect that is interoception.
I see.
Proprioception is like movement, and so you move your arm over your head, and you have the ability to engage in proprioception, and so you know that your body is moving in physical space. And the idea is that it's our ability to recognize that our body is changing that gives us the ability to experience what we call emotion. And so emotion is just us detecting things like accelerated heart rates and the tensing of the muscles. And that's the theory that I sort of subscribe to when I think about emotional experience. So any questions before I sort of talk about why that relates to my interest in posed facial expressions? And so if this,
I mean, so just so you know, my kind of default perspective on this is I tend to think of usually the emotions coming first and being drivers, and the conscious articulation of these things is just a story that we're telling ourselves that is often like, I question how accurate the story is, our ability to articulate why, a reason why any of us give for having a feeling or experiencing something is, I think, shaky usually. I think that you had the emotion first, and then you behaved in a way, and then afterwards you make up an explanation for why that did that. That may have been primed by completely other things that that were, subconscious processes or whatever, or things, cues within the environment that you weren't at all privy to.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting study on that, Shane, where so first I'll kind of talk about like the nuance there, and then I'll tell you about the study. The nuance is that, emotion is broad. And so the sort of claim is that emotional experience, the conscious experience of emotion is in part based on our ability to detect these changes in our body. But emotion happens before experience, right? Something in the environment occurs, and we sort of cognitively evaluate the meaning of that change. And so like I dropped my coffee, and I'm just like, okay, what does this mean for me? Oh, well, that was my last bit of coffee. So this is devastating. My day is going to be ruined. And that creates this like physiological change in me. And I'm sensing this physiological change. And so that sensing of the change is the conscious experience of emotion. But I think you're right that, afterwards we might then say like, well, why am I feeling this way? And maybe I think that I feel sad about dropping my cup of coffee, but maybe I'm actually sad about the fact that, I don't know, coffee is really, a really like weird market, and it sort of exploits certain forms of labor. Like maybe there's more to it. Maybe I'm not even aware of why I'm sad. But that's sort of like a meaning.
I just think there's like, there's like lots of little things like that break the dam. Like you just have a lot of other stuff going on all of the time, and then like the coffee thing that happens, it was unexpected, and there's just this emotional release of all the other shit that you're dealing with at the moment that you're kind of pinning on coffee, and then like the conscious articulation as well seems to be like, consciousness seems like such a dramatizer as well. Like like the story is always so grandiose compared to the small nuanced thing that may have happened.
I think there's really good evidence that we often are unaware of the things that are causing us to, experience a certain emotion. And so, like, of course, like, there's going to be like one psychodynamic psychologist like listening to this podcast is going to get really excited, like, oh my God, Freud said that. But like, there's also been a lot of work in social psychology where we find the same thing. And so, actually, one of the studies that I ran with Jeff recently, this was a facial feedback study. So I guess it kind of gets into facial feedback now. But we had people pose expressions of anger. We had them pose expressions of happiness, and they weren't doing anything other than just posing these expressions and staring at a blank screen. And what we found is that people felt a little angry after they posed expressions of anger. It was mild, of course, right? They're not like raging, punching holes in walls, but they felt a little pissed off. And we found that they felt,
I can't do it and not feel silly. I can't see my angry face.
Yeah. I'm not like the best at like posing facial expressions of emotion, but yeah. So we would teach these people how to do it. They were a little pissed off after they posed scowls. They were a little happy after they posed smiles. But what was interesting is this study was done for like totally different reasons than showing that people could feel anger after scowling. But at the end of the study, we asked people, do you believe that posing facial expressions of emotion will impact your emotion? And a lot of people who posed expressions of anger and then felt angry, and posed expressions of happiness and then felt happy, then at the end of the study said, no, but posing facial expressions doesn't impact your emotions. And that suggests that they were completely unaware of the fact that their emotions were changing throughout the course of our study. There's other examples in the literature where this has been documented as well. But I think it just sort of gets to your point that we're often unaware of our changes in emotion. And the study I wanted to tell you about was, this is a really classic social psychology study by Schachter and Singer. It doesn't replicate perfectly well, so I'm going to just kind of, warn you of that ahead of time. But some of it seems maybe true, but some of it false. But this was a study, I believe it was done in like the 60s. And they would take undergrads and they would inject them with epinephrine, which just makes you feel really excited. And of course, we can't do this anymore. But this back in the day, I guess you could just bring people in and inject them with epinephrine. What they found was that, this is simplifying the study a little bit, but you could inject people with epinephrine and sort of fool them into thinking that they're really annoyed about something or really excited about something, because you produced this change in their physiology that they are now, thinking must have an emotional cause, because it's not every day that we suddenly get this like burst of adrenaline from epinephrine. So parts of the study don't replicate too well, but I think this overall idea of you can experience changes in your bodily states that then can manifest and seem like they're caused by something emotional. That part of this seems to be true.
So that's really interesting. So you exaggerate, you chemically induce like an exaggerated physiological response, and that displays as a more exaggerated emotional experience or articulation of what they're so people will be like more worried or more excited about, they'd just be less even keeled generally. Right.
And there's really interesting studies where like some of this is so obvious to like, it's like some people like when you think of it, it becomes obvious. So like some of the other studies give people beta blockers, and beta blockers are like essentially make it really hard to experience anxiety, right? And so we know that there's all sorts of ways that we can kind of, change our experience by changing our physiology. So like in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious proposition, but it's for me like very thought provoking. Like, I don't know, like, as someone who like really spent a lot of time thinking like, well, how is it that we're able to experience emotion? Like, what is that thing? To kind of settle on that seemingly true answer of like, well, it's you noticing changes in your physiology. And of course, you have your situation. So you use the situation to assign causes and to maybe like give it more nuanced meaning. But that sort of change in your heart rate and the tensing of your muscles, that's that thing that is emotion. And it is a feeling. It's a feeling just like taste is. It's a sense. And so that's sort of the theoretical grounding that I sort of have in this literature.
It does. I guess there's always caution warranted when something seems obvious or intuitive. I'm curious why that hasn't replicated, because it does seem, if you just look at, if you're hungover, you're going to feel like just off, like everything in life is miserable and like, God, I just want to die. You're just hungover for a few hours. Whereas if you drink too much coffee, you might find yourself feeling a bit more anxious about what you have going on or the state of the world or whatever else. I remember, so I broke my feet once and I had to crawl down a mountain with 2 broken feet. And I remembered I'd been practicing meditation quite a bit at this time, and I'm grateful for that because it helped with my relationship to pain. But also I noticed this interesting thing, which it was like a few hours that I had to crawl down a mountain. And there was a moment when I found myself thinking about the political climate and different various. I think maybe I was on like a little bit of a healthcare trip or whatever, but then I was just thinking about politicians and stuff, and I remember saying to myself like, "Oh, the whole system's broken," and then I thought, "Oh, wait a second. I'm broken right now. I'm literally broken, and I'm projecting that onto these huge, complex, kind of intangible, dynamic systems that I can't possibly. The best I can do is have like a silly heuristic or worldview on it, but and then I'm just projecting my current internal feelings onto that. Like, screw all those politicians. They're all corrupt. They're all broken. It's like, oh, well, yes, maybe, but also my feet are broken right now. And that's coming. That's a factor in my judgment of how the world feels to me right now.
Yeah. They call that affect misattribution, at least in the social psychology literature. A lot of people have studied it and try to figure out like, when does it occur? When does it not occur? Because sometimes it doesn't, right? It's like sometimes we break our arm and we're like, I'm so glad that things in the world aren't broken. So like, it doesn't seem like we always do it, but yeah, like intuitively we sometimes engage in this practice. And, like I know like one of the reasons why I love caffeine so much is that it makes boring things seem a little bit more exciting to me. And so I remember in graduate school when I would take the really boring classes, that's the day I would always drink a little bit more coffee in hopes that I could, first of all, be alert, but also like maybe if I could just accelerate my heart rate enough, I'll actually find multi-level modeling exciting. And, spoiler alert, I do find multi-level modeling really exciting, but maybe it's because of the, affect misattribution.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great way to think about coffee. I'm going. I never thought about it like that. I thought like, yeah, it keeps you awake longer, but like to actually just a little nudge in the excitement department when doing something that might be a little more tedious.
I always, as dating advice to students who I would train, I'd always say, first date, coffee, roller coaster. Like those are like the two things you have to do, and they will find you so exciting, even if you're just a boring researcher. And so I think there might be something to that advice. Although, like most things in science, I'm sure it's far more complicated than we can speculate initially. But that's the sort of stuff that got me interested in whether posing facial expressions can influence emotion. Because if those theories are true, then posing facial expressions of emotion should also provide some feedback. This time it's proprioceptive as opposed to interoceptive. So it's from the muscles, not the heart and the heart rate and things like that. And so if those theories are true, then we should be able to pose an expression, like a happy expression, and feel a little bit happier, and pose an angry expression and feel a little bit angrier. And so that's something I've spent way more time studying than I thought I would be spending. A fun fact for those who have listened to Jeff Larson on this podcast, when I first told Jeff that I wanted to study this a little bit, I think I was a first year graduate student, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a cool project. That'll just take us like 6 months, right?" 5 years later, I was finishing my PhD, and I'd spent all 5 years studying that tiny little topic. So these things always are more complicated and take longer than we think that they will.
So I think this is going to just a hair, kind of a maybe tangent that I think will really get us into the facial stuff really well. But there's been a few things that's that have come up during this. How do I articulate this? So as you're talking about the coffee, and there's my notes. This is what my brain looks like. So the coffee and roller coaster, that's a clever, what do you call that? The false attribution, or
misattribution, affect misattribution.
Affect misattribution. There's it reminded me, it's the second time during this that I've been reminded of another podcast that I just did, researching the psychology of why people like horror movies. And actually potentially creating a therapeutic model for situations where they might work well for kind of emotional training. So one of the things that came up was the cuddle effect that happens from, to take a date to a scary movie and they might grab you for comfort or whatever. And then, that's a weird, like, these things are just an impulse. Obviously, it's not like terribly well thought through. If a girl like thinks for a moment that I can protect her from some demon, like casting spells or whatever on stage, like, no, I can't protect you from much. Definitely not demon spells, but I'll take the cuddle effect. But I thought of this when you're talking about watching the movie Up and getting the sadness fix, because he was this Colton Scrivener. He was talking about his take was that there's actually, it seems people that are into the horror genre actually are more anxious people. And there might be reasons why they like horror. One might be that people that are more anxious are just more visually attentive to stress and stressful situations, and so they immerse themselves within the movie more than the average person, and that immersion is part of the experience of pleasure and why we enjoy things. But he also made up, why I'm bringing it up is he thought that it was actually kind of a safe way for, like, there's a lot of research that shows that the horror genre viewing went up quite a bit at the beginning of COVID and everything. But it was actually, when people are experiencing anxiety, one, it can be a distraction to be like, oh, there's a different anxiety that I need to be worried about for 2 hours, and then it goes away. Rather than an acute stressor, or a chronic stressor, it's an acute one. And then, but also there's an ability to regulate it. Like, you can cover your eyes and like sort of look, you can turn the volume down when you're at home. And I thought about that with sadness in the movie Up as well. If like maybe there's aspects of life that are too sad or something that you don't want to think about, and watching a movie like Up or something can sort of help be an emotional release or kind of emotional training, and like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I don't know, just some stuff I thought I'd share with you that was really relevant.
Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about it, but that's a really interesting idea.
Well, anyway, let's talk about the facial expression stuff. So, one, now that you've set up some of these basics, how about this pencil study that I've promised people?
Oh yeah. So in 1988, I believe, Strack, Martin, and Stepper ran a study where they had participants hold a pen in their mouth in a manner that either sort of facilitated smiling, so made it so that you could smile, or inhibited smiling. And they had people hold these pens in their mouth while they were looking at some humorous cartoons. And they found that when you held the pen in your mouth in a manner that sort of facilitated the smiles, that you found the cartoons to be slightly more humorous. This was a literal textbook finding in psychology. Like I learned about it when I was in Intro to Psych 10 years ago. And in 2016, a massive team of researchers, 17 labs, all attempted to replicate the study. All 17 of them failed. And there's still, some like kind of messy debates about why they failed to replicate. But this sort of renewed discussions, it shocked psychologists and sort of, I guess, started up these discussions like, well, maybe the effect isn't real. And this was interesting because when that failure to replicate happened, I was actually a first-year graduate student. And that's when I went to Jeff and I said, hey, we should do this sort of thing where we take all of the studies that have ever been done on this. So people have been studying this for a very long time now. And let's take all of the evidence, let's combine it into a single statistical model and see what's going on. And what we found is that despite the fact that some researchers weren't able to replicate that pen and mouth effect that became sort of like the poster child of this area of inquiry, even though that didn't seem to cleanly replicate, there seemed to be a small but reliable effect there. And so it did seem that when we looked at all of the evidence, that smiles could make people feel slightly happier and frowns could make them feel slightly sadder. But maybe there's a reason why that pen and mouth effect isn't working. And so that's sort of the background with like the controversy around this idea is like, you had your poster child study. It's not cleanly replicating. It's not clear why it's not cleanly replicating. And so a lot of my research that I've done on this has been trying to figure out, well, why is it that there seems to be a real effect, but we can't get it with that pen and mouth manipulation? So that's sort of the background with that pen and mouth study that I think a lot of people have heard about.
Yeah, it's sideways. That's how you do it. You put it in sideways.
Some people do it sideways. Some people do it straight. And there's actually a lot of differences in the methodology, which is one of the problems of that method. Is we need to agree on how we're going to do it first, or else we're going to be comparing apples to oranges. And so but some people do it like well, of course your listeners can't see that, but sometimes the pen is pointing.
There's video as well.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
People can watch on YouTube. They'll see me giving a perfect demonstration. But yeah, I guess for the listener, if you just try to, if you hold the pen sideways in your teeth, it'll force a smile. If you, and there's other ways of doing it, but if you put a pen the long ways in your mouth and then try to point it up, it will kind of make you frown a little bit. I think that's it. But yeah. So what's, and then there's all of the I've been thinking about this. There's all this kind of embodied cognition sort of stuff it's gotten really popular over the last 10 years or so. I think I know like, what is it? Emmy Cuddy at Harvard kind of is popular for these power pose things. And I know some of that stuff hasn't replicated that well. It's clearly, it's clearly kind of permeating the cultural zeitgeist a bit because I was just watching Ted Lasso season 2
so amazing. The
other day. Such a good show. But there was a season where the owner of the team, she gives a bit of advice about displaying confidence and dominance in a situation, and says that when she has to walk into a tough, intimidating meeting, that she goes into front of the mirror and does this big thing and roars and stuff. But this is so the reason I'm bringing it up is because we're seeing references to this work in pop culture now. That's how popular it's becoming, and which leads me more and more to believe that I bet it's not going to replicate that well. We'll see.
Yeah.
What's your take on all that stuff?
Yeah. So it's weird, Shane, because like I've occupied this very strange spot in the debate, and so a lot of research I've done has reliably shown that posing facial expressions of emotion can cause people to experience those emotions a little bit. But my sort of, I guess I've occupied a weird position in this debate because I've sort of argued along with my colleagues that this is theoretically interesting, but not pragmatically interesting. And so we say like this leads to small increases in happiness, but it's not big enough to like matter for most people. Like basically saying like, listen, pop culture, stop paying attention to us because this is like interesting because we're sort of developing some theories about what emotion is, but this increase in happiness that we're seeing is extremely small. And I'll have a paper that will hopefully be coming out in a couple of years. That's how long it takes for a paper to get published. The data's in now. But I have this paper that I think will show it quite nicely. So we had people around the world, I think it was 23 countries, pose these happy expressions. And we found that, across the world, it led to this small increase in happiness. And we said, awesome, this theory about what is emotional feeling is supported. We're finding that, proprioceptive feedback from the face, facial movements are influencing emotion. So that was the exciting part. But the thing that maybe is less exciting to people is we also just looked at how happy people felt after they looked at some pictures of puppies and rainbows and butterflies. And we found that just looking at pictures of puppies and rainbows and butterfly more reliably increased happiness than these posed expressions of happiness. And the magnitude of that increase was larger. So like if you really want that small boost in happiness, you could just look at a picture of a puppy, if you like puppies, and that will have a larger impact on your happiness than posing a smile. And so that's the kind of weird spot that I feel like I've occupied in these discussions where I say like, I think the effect is real. I think that it's too small to like be like worthy of a TED Talk. And when it comes to the power posing stuff, that's also very controversial, but very related, right? So a lot of my research is posing facial expressions. That's posing like a full body expression of power. And basically my take on that literature, and I think a lot of people share this view, but perhaps not, is that a lot of the claims are not replicating. And so the claims were that if you did a power pose, it would make you feel more powerful. It would reduce cortisol levels. It would have all these other downstream physiological consequences that would be good for you. Essentially, what it seems is going on is none of those physiological effects are occurring. We're not reliably seeing that posing this power pose can like decrease cortisol levels. We are finding reliably that it can make people feel more powerful. So the experience of emotion, once again, like you feel more powerful, whether there's a physiological response going along with that, that doesn't seem to replicate as well. That's the controversial part, but it does seem to lead to changes in your, conscious, subjective experience of power. And so that's sort of my take on that debate. Although I'm sure there's plenty of people who would, argue with me about this, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm personally with you. Obviously, you know quite a bit more about the subject, and so take my opinion with a grain of salt. But it seems like, I don't mean to say this as like a condescending way to like, oh, people that don't get science or whatever. I mean, from an experiential point of view of myself having gotten so excited about learning many studies about various studies through the years and finding out that like a small difference in, say, gender or age or like some behavior between like two different groups is scientifically very exciting. To find like the tiniest little, but that's often not conveyed very well when these findings make it into the public sphere. It's not the headline sharing this research usually isn't conveying a bunch of nuance. It's usually, the attention grabbing, exciting, speaking of headlines, there was an amazing one for this or subheader for one of the links that you sent me this was about, can Botox ease depression by eliminating frowns? Researchers have doubts. And then this woman, Kathleen O'Grady, a little tip of the hat to the person that wrote this, the subheader she wrote, study claiming evidence for the unusual treatment raises eyebrows. Very clever. I enjoy a good pun. Do you think when you write something like that, do you think like you pat yourself on the back, or are you just like, this'll work? Whatever, just another day in the office. I don't know how I would.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I gotta write things like that. Sometimes I'm like, that's very clever, Shane. And no one's ever going to appreciate the stupid little connection that I made. And then other times I'm like, suckers will go for this. But anyway, the point is that a lot of times when these studies are introduced to the public doesn't know to kind of walk back the findings a little bit. I include myself in the public, and know that it's a little more nuanced or just subtle.
Yeah, Shane, I have like probably 6 thoughts on this, but I'm gonna list the quick ones and then the longer ones. The quick one is that Kathleen O'Grady is an amazing journalist. And if people are interested in really good... I
loved that subheader.
Yeah, really good science journalism, look at Kathleen O'Grady's writings. The fact that she even wrote that article, I think shows how real she is, right? Because a lot of... So as someone who studies the facial feedback hypothesis, I get a lot of emails from people saying like, oh, we read about your research. We want to publish something in Harper's Magazine about how you can smile your way to happiness. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, here's the thing. The effects are like really, really small. I don't think that this actually will like impact your well-being. It's just like theoretically interesting. And then I never hear from them again. Kathleen O'Grady, I love working with her because she wants to kind of think about it in a realistic way. And so the background for that article is that Jeff Larson and I had written a critique of that idea. So in this scenario, there are actually researchers who are claiming that freezing the frowny muscles via Botox will eliminate depression. And they're citing, our work on the facial feedback hypothesis, saying like, well, there's all this work demonstrating that posing smiles can make people feel happier. And there's this theory of emotional embodiment. So if we just freeze the frowny muscles, depression will go away. And I reviewed the evidence along with Jeff Larson and a couple of our colleagues. And we found that the claims did not appear to be credible whatsoever. So we had written an article saying that the claims should raise some eyebrows, Shane. So that's, I think, where that pun came from. We said, claims that Botox can eliminate depression should raise some eyebrows. And we, articulated the various reasons why we don't think that this is a plausible claim. And I have to like really tip my hat to Kathleen O'Grady for seeing this like critical piece of science, knowing that she would get a lot more clicks if she wrote about how you can eliminate depression via Botox and writing about the critical perspective.
Oh
instead.
no, I was paying her a compliment, and then but that wasn't that's the same kind of, that wasn't the kind of clickbaity headline that I was referencing. That was just a clever thing that made me laugh.
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
But generally speaking, it is, I've just fallen for this. I know this firsthand so well because over and over again. So I'll go on a comedy podcast, and when I do that, I'm like the science guy. I don't have any scientific training or anything. I just talk with you guys a bunch. And And so I tend to the fun, exciting studies are the ones that that are they're such great conversation, and then I'll go, and I know I'm not alone. I know professors do this too, because I'll learn these things from a lecture, and then I'll be talking with an academic that studies the field, and I'll relate the study to be like, hey, I know a little bit about your field. How about this thing? It just without fail, like 90% of the time at least, they're like, actually, even people's own work, they're like, well, that was exciting when I found that 10 years ago, and now it's, a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah. It's such an interesting point, Shane. And right now there's, a lot of people say that there's sort of like a replication crisis going on, not just in psychology, but in a lot of scientific disciplines. Whereas a lot of things that we thought were very reliable and true appear to be unreliable, or at worst, not true. And and I think it gets back to one of your earlier points about sort of like the complexity of human behavior. And human behavior is extremely complicated, and it's hard to study the complexity. And so there's a lot of I think there's a lot of reform happening in science where we're trying to develop methods that can help us obtain more reliable, more generalizable knowledge. And I don't know if you looked through all the links that I sent, but of course, if you did, like, that's something that I'm really excited about these days. It's like trying to make a better science.
Yeah, I did. And I'm interested in hearing about the Science Accelerator, and but can we put a pin in that just for a moment to finish a few of the thoughts on the topic that we're on, and we'll get to that, because you have a little. If we ran a little long today, you'd be okay.
I already canceled my whole day.
Okay,
perfect excuse not to take
awesome.
meetings.
So this, I've heard that it's even been prescribed in, say, call centers. You're at a cubicle, and they'll put a mirror in the cubicle, so when you're on the phone with the customer, you're supposed to kind of remind yourself to smile, and then that's conveyed through the phone. That comes across as a better experience. And maybe first off, it wouldn't surprise me if there was a subtle finding here and there. Maybe that would be, maybe there'd be ways of kind of seeing through customer reviews of customer service or whatever, some control and experimental condition where this business doesn't use the mirror thing, this business does. Who knows? There'd be a lot of other variables that would have to be considered. But when I've tried myself to make myself smile in front of the mirror, when I'm usually in a pretty dark place when I resort to the old, maybe the smiling in the mirror trick will work. It feels to me, in the times that it does seem to offer a little bit of a mood boost, it feels like, to me, what's happening in my inner world and inner monologue is that it feels silly enough. If I do it for long enough, it feels silly enough that I just start like making myself laugh at just how ridiculous what I'm doing it is. And I just think about how bizarre the human condition is, and the idea that if that is working, that that's all you have to do is it. And that makes me think, like, what are the controls in studies like that? Because could you just as easily cluck like a chicken or something like that, like do your favorite character from Arrested Development's chicken dance or something?
Yeah. Would
that offer the same mood boost as smiling in front of a mirror? It's just, I don't know. What's your take on that? Because I want to talk a little bit more about this Botox thing, which I'm probably not the only one that's creeped out by that. There's something strange about it. I mean, I'm not, and that's not to rag on like cosmetic. I have a dead tooth. I'll probably get a cap on one day. Maybe I'll get my teeth whitened. Who knows? Maybe when I'm 50, I'll get an ass implant or something like that, so that my ass reflects how I feel on the inside or something. But
well, let's make a GoFundMe for that.
but there's something about like getting rid of your ability to frown or something that seems so creepy and weird to me. And I don't know. All right. I threw all that at you. Have at it.
3 big thoughts. One, earlier in this conversation, you mentioned how you're like, oh, well, I'm not a scientist. I just talk to scientists or whatever. And, this is like a weird little compliment, but I've been wanting to say it for a while. So I'm just going to say it anyways. Shane, you think exactly like a scientist does think. Like, I listen to your podcast a lot, and this is a true fact. In my performance,
you're trying to make me cry, aren't you? Aren't you, Nicholas? Not happening. Not till we watch Up together.
Maybe some tears of joy. I have to get this out there. So at Standford University, I have to fill out like a self-performance review where I say like, here are like what I think my flaws are. Here is what I want to do to get better at it. And one of the flaws that I pointed out was I said, I think that I have a very narrow perspective in science. I know a lot about emotion, the science of emotion. I know so little about all these other fascinating areas of science. And of course, part of this exercise is like, I didn't have to tell my boss, like, this is what I'm going to do to try to fix it. And I can send you the copy of this performance review. I said, I'm going to listen to Here We Are podcast so I can learn more about some like random science stuff.
Oh man, that's sort of scary to me, actually. Like now pressure. Now I'm influencing scientists. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, but
that's a heck of a compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The cicada episode, by the way, was really awesome.
Oh yeah, that was awesome. Barrett Klein is coming back on. I think December we're doing a sleep episode for the listeners. That'll be to him and Slatin Krishan, another one of my most listened to guests, are going to be talking about sleep. So that'll be a good one.
Yeah, that's going to be great. So anyways, one of the reasons why I brought that up is because you said like, oh, well, maybe this is just sort of like a silly thing. You're posing this smile and it's just so ridiculous. And so it makes you feel happy. And one of the reasons why it made me think of your ability to reason like a scientist is because this is something that experts in the field have commented on when they're reviewing my papers. So like people who have thought a lot about this worry about the same thing. And so the way that we've addressed this in some of our studies, there's a couple of ways. One is that we have them engage in similarly silly tasks. So we'll say something like, you're going to tap your ear once per second for 5 seconds. And it's kind of weird. It's kind of silly. But we find that it doesn't increase happiness to the extent that the post smile does. So then you might think like, okay, well, maybe it's just not as crazy. Maybe it's not as like silly as posing a smile. And the reason why we don't believe that explanation sort of accounts for our results is because if it was just like the sheer silliness of the act of posing facial expressions of emotion that's causing the uptick in happiness, we should see that posing other facial expressions of emotion also cause increases in happiness. Because, staring at a screen like, pouting and being all scowly, that's a pretty silly thing too. But we don't find that it makes people feel happier. We find that it makes them feel angrier. And we'll have people pose. Yeah,
that's a very good point. Yeah.
And same with posed expressions of sadness, which are harder to make, but it's like, sorry, listener, I'm posing and I'm trying my best to pose an expression of sadness. It would be better if we were watching. This would be a good
one. I'm trying to get more people over to YouTube anyway. So this is a good episode for them to, yeah.
Yeah, if you're watching it on YouTube, you'd see that Shane's been crying the entire time. Yeah, we find that people pose expressions of sadness and they report feeling sadder, posing expressions of anger and report feeling angry. And of course, these effects are very, very small, right? So as I mentioned earlier, you're not punching holes in the wall, you're not sobbing. It's just a tiny little change, but it's theoretically interesting because we think it suggests that there's this feedback coming from the body that's informing your experience of emotion.
Yeah, because I guess the other thing that it makes me think is how much is I don't know, is placebo effect the right word? There is something there's something interesting about putting yourself through something. That's like, well, I wouldn't be doing this for nothing, you know. I wouldn't be posing like all big in front of the mirror and doing this mantra and pep talk if it didn't work, you know. Like the fact that you're doing it convinces you that it works, which then does make it work. It's like I advocate that instead of like buying snake oil, you make your own, because in the process you'll need to learn about snakes, you need to wrangle snakes, you need to oil them, however that works. It's like a whole learning process. And then if you do all of that, and then you have like your you know, you have like a little tincture of snake oil or whatever, and you've gone through all of the work of getting that snake oil, it's probably going to be more than just the omega-3s that are going to lead to some positive improvement. Yes. Because it's this reinforcer that, like, oh, I've done all of these things right, and that really, I mean, it's such a powerful effect. And as always, if you're a listener to the show, you know, you probably know that I say this a lot, but as a reminder to listeners, when I say placebo effect, that's not to negate. I actually think the placebo effect is like much of what life is about and makes life worth living and is super powerful. So it's not to say it's nothing, but it's just something that always needs to be considered in all of this kind of research.
Yeah. So, it's, you know, Shane, I'm like about to like jump out of my chair because it's so funny that you mentioned that, because it's literally what I'm studying right now. And Jeff, myself, Lowell Gertner, Brick Froelich, we have a paper. A draft of it is actually available online to like a listener who actually wants to read the paper, but we'll be resubmitting it for a second round of peer review soon, where we wanted to look at exactly this. And the reason why I'm so excited is because I didn't tell Shane that we ran this study. So this is like organically, right? This is another example, Shane, you're thinking exactly like a scientist does, because that's exactly the thought that Jeff and I and Lowell Gertner and Brooke had of like, maybe this is a placebo effect. And so we ran 6 studies to look at this. And there was a couple of ways that we tried to look at this placebo effect. And we thought it was a placebo effect. So that was sort of our baseline belief of like, okay, we have this small effect. It doesn't seem to be like that important for like, you know, it's too small to like make people like revolutionize their lives. And we think that it might just be a placebo effect. So we ran a study where we brought participants in and we said, hey, we're going to have you pose some facial expressions of emotion. And we believe that it's going to impact your emotions. So that was one group. And then the other group, we said, we do not think this is going to impact your emotion. And consistent with research on placebo effect, those instructions mattered. The effects of facial feedback are much bigger when you can kind of introduce those placebo considerations and tell people ahead of time, like, this is going to impact your emotions. But what was striking was, contrary to our own initial hypotheses, we still found that people reported feeling slightly happier after posing happy expressions, slightly angrier after posing angry expressions, even when we told them ahead of time that we did not think that was going to happen. And we even went a step further and told them the purpose of this study is to demonstrate that this is actually like not an effect whatsoever. And so that had a few limitations, right? It's like maybe participants came in and said, like, I don't agree. Like, you say it's not real, but I know it's real. So we ran some follow-up studies where we asked participants, like some of them like months before they went into our study, do you think posing facial expressions of emotion can cause you to experience those emotions? And once again, evidence of the power of the placebo effect, those beliefs mattered. But even people who told us either right before the experiment, several months before the experiment, right after the experiment, doesn't matter when we measured it, some participants said, I do not think that posing facial expressions of emotion will impact my emotions. And they still exhibited this facial feedback effect. They were still reporting that they were slightly annoyed after posing angry expressions, slightly happy after posing happy expressions. And so what I found so interesting about this, these series of studies is that we did demonstrate how impactful placebo effects can be. But contrary to our own initial beliefs, it didn't seem to explain the effect. Even if you don't believe that smiling will make you feel happier, it led to a tiny little increase in happiness, albeit a very small one. If you're really trying to make yourself feel happy, listen to Here We Are or look at pictures of puppies or whatever. There are much better ways of making yourself feel happier than this little pose of happiness.
Puppy pics all day. I mean, there's you got to get on Instagram. There's great stuff going on with there's a lot of good raccoon memes making the rounds right now. There's a lot of, if you follow me on Instagram, I post a lot of fun animal stuff on my stories that'll brighten your day. And if you want to feel miserable, you can follow me on Twitter, where I'll complain about a lot of things. So I'd like to cover all my bases. How long were participants asked to make this expression?
5 seconds. And we chose 5 seconds because it most closely resembles the duration of a true, authentic expression of happiness.
Interesting. Well, because going back to some of the social pressure stuff of the cultural differences, like when you mentioned the Netherlands, it made me think, when I'm out and about in social situation, I have a lot of different groups that I hang out with. I have my comic friends, and then sometimes I'm around relatives, or I'm like at the pickleball court with a bunch of strangers or something like that. And so there's varying levels of social dynamics, but there's also varying levels of comedy savviness. And I'm like, in the Netherlands, will they fake laugh at jokes as kind of a social lubricant? Because it's something that it's painful for me. It's like, I want to be nice. An experience as a comic is someone's like, they're a comic, they must love jokes. I know jokes. Let me tell. It just happened. I mean, it happens all the time. I feel bad. I'm sure there's going to be some like pickleballers that I play with listening to this or something. But once in a while, there's just these cringy moments that happen, and sometimes the right thing to do feels like, oh, you just like give it a little fake laugh and move on, and it doesn't, it's not crickets. It's not like an abrupt, it doesn't make things awkward. It's just, you move on, but it's also like painful for me too. Cause it's just, I just have a more sophisticated, comedy palette than a lot of people, and it makes me, I guess, a little bit of a snob in some sense. I have plenty of friends that aren't comics that make me laugh way harder than my comedy friends. But there's definitely there's a lot of people out there that are not very comedy savvy and still think like classic dumb knock jokes and stuff are just the most hilarious thing in the world. And it's kind of a painful situation to be in. But the reason why I asked about the length of time in that was because I feel like smiling in front of the mirror for a little bit to pick yourself up is a different experience than kind of what we were talking about of working in customer service for all day, where you're truly putting on a face that's exhausting. I mean, acting is social acting is something that requires skill or requires effort. It requires effort to behave in a way that is different than what your intuition and feeling is. It's different than your default. It's different than you would be doing authentically. And so, I I don't know what your thoughts are on any of on kind of the idea of, like, I don't know, like a study where it's like, hey, you need to act happy
Yeah.
for 30 minutes, I think would make people really miserable, you know?
Yeah. It's such an interesting point. And so oftentimes this is sort of called like emotion labor. And it's tricky. This is actually a study I want to run in the future, because there is quite a bit of evidence showing that people who have to engage in a lot of emotion labor tend to feel a little bit more burnt out. They tend to be a little bit less satisfied with life. And so, in this scenario, they're saying like emotion labor is sort of like a detrimental, hard form of labor. Right? Like it's not something we enjoy doing, which makes sense. But we need to tell people that, right? And one of the tricky things is that there's what's happening is we're wrapping up a lot of things into one. So you are faking a smile, which according to William James's theory should cause that minor increase of happiness. But you're also doing it in an extremely unpleasant circumstance. So you have that sort of working against your actual emotional experience. There's also these very strange power dynamics going on where it's like often if you're the one performing emotional labor, you're sort of in the non-dominant position. And so one of my sort of untested hypotheses is that the power of that situation, of that unpleasant situation with sort of non-ideal power dynamics for the person expressing the emotion, I think that the emotional implications of that situation outweigh any tiny boost in happiness that you get from actually posing that expression of happiness. And the way that you could empirically test that would be to have people sort of engage in the same type of emotion regulation. Sorry, not emotion regulation, expression regulation. And so like, I don't know, like to make it simpler, we both, like you have two groups of people, they both deal with a really bad customer. They have to convince this customer that they're happy and it's not really that big of a deal. But in one condition, you force them to pose that smile during it. And in another condition, you don't force them to pose a smile, or maybe you have them pose a neutral expression. You say like in this business, the customer wants you to be completely stoic. And what I suspect would happen if the sort of theory of emotional embodiment is true is that people are experiencing a little bit more happiness when they have to pose that expression of happiness when they engage in that emotional labor. But the situation is just way too powerful. The very fact that you have to deal with this angry customer and try to convince them that you're not upset at them, that is such a more potent elicitor of negative emotions that no amount of smiling will sort of undo that. So that's kind of my working hypothesis, is that there's two things going on. There's the negative situation that's forcing you to do emotion labor, that's bringing your emotions down. And then there's that actual posed expression, which is kind of slightly bringing your emotions up. But overall, it's a negative experience because of how difficult the customers are. So that's sort of, it's a hypothesis I would love to test, because I think it's really interesting that I can bring people into an experimental setting, have them pose a happy expression and see a small increase of happiness, yet know from personal experience and from the literature that egregious amounts of emotional labor do not tend to be associated with higher levels of well-being.
I love the phrase egregious amounts of emotional labor. I think that we need to get emotional labor, the term emotional labor, into the mainstream more. I think that would resonate with lots and lots of people. Might be the title of this episode, actually. It's emotional labor. Oh man, long day, a lot of emotional labor. That's
I think what's so brilliant. So there's a sociologist who coined this term, and there's such a illustrious sociologist that I should know their name, but I don't. So maybe like when you're chatting, I'm going to Google it really quickly. Hirschfield, I think it's Hirschfield, but I'm going to Google it anyway. So
Hal Hirschfield?
No. I'm going to Google it when you're talking so I don't distract the listener.
Sure.
This idea of emotion labor, it's been around for a while. Maybe it hasn't sort of like made its way into the mainstream yet. But when I learned about it, I found it so validating because it's sort of like an invisible form of labor that we don't always know we're engaging in. And so, like I worked at a theme park for a while and I'd come home and it'd be like really exhausting. And I'd be like, like sometimes you're like, why am I so exhausted? Like I just like made people like happy all day. I was just like pulling harnesses down and like taking out trash. Like it doesn't seem like it's that hard of a job, but then you realize that you engaged in emotional labor and you saw like 60,000 people that day and you had to convince all 60,000 of those people that like they're at a very happy place. And that can really wear on people. And I think that as we kind of talked about earlier in the discussion, like certain groups of people have to do it more. So this could be like something based on like your profession, based on your gender, based on your race, based on racial identity, based on a lot of factors. And so that's something I'm also interested in, is the fact that some people have to do it more often than others. And I'm now in a situation where I don't have to engage in much emotional labor. Right? Like academics can kind of be like stoic or angry, and there's like, oh, they're deep. They're not mad at me. They're just really deep in thought. So I don't have to engage in it as much as I used to. And now I've learned about that being an invisible form of labor. And I wish that people knew about it as well, because it might help them realize why they find like a retail job so exhausting, or why they find a Thanksgiving dinner with some family members that they don't love, just to be so exhausting, because they're faking this smile for 2 hours and they're pretending that everything's okay, and that takes effort.
Yeah. Just there's a lot of value in feeling seen or having things like this with that help kind of explain some of these mysteries of life. Just knowing that alone and being mindful of it, I think does create a little bit of opportunity to kind of let yourself off of the hook a little bit. And well, as we start wrapping up,
Shane, one quick interjection. My Google search.
You found it?
Yeah, it's Arlie.
I was killing time till you found that name.
Arlie Hochschild. I'm so embarrassed that I didn't remember the name, but Arlie Hochschild, really brilliant.
I never
work.
remember names.
Yeah, I'm terrible.
Okay, awesome. So as we wrap up, do you want to? I don't know if you want to touch on the accelerator or whatever. I'm definitely interested. We haven't talked much about the replication crisis at all on this podcast. It probably warrants at least its own episode at some point. But it's also, yeah, I would love to hear your take on it and some of the things that you're involved with to combat it. It's something that's been seemingly talked about quite a bit more, at least that I'm seeing more and more over the last 5-10 years or whatever. And you're a young scientist. You're probably I think it's hopefully something that the younger people entering the field are maybe going to be really mindful of and help correct. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I always worry, I thought a lot about this, Shane. I worry about talking about the replication crisis because like, I think that it can be co-opted by science deniers, but
I know.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I'm gonna talk about it anyways. I'd rather be transparent about the issue because that's like a good, characteristic of science, I think, is that we can be truthful about these problems. But what we're finding, at least in social psychology, is that there are a lot of specific demonstrations of effects that when we try to run the same exact study later on, that we're unable to replicate. And so there's been a few projects demonstrating this, but one of the biggest ones was called the Replication Project Psychology. They took a very large number of findings in the psychology literature and reran the experiments as closely as possible. and found that the large majority of them couldn't be replicated. They couldn't get the same exact results. And so this has spurred what many people have called the replication crisis. And it, I think, sort of got a lot of attention in psychology over the past 5-10 years. But I will say what I think we're quickly learning is that it applies to a lot of fields. And so a lot of research in cancer biology is in replicating cleanly. And one of the reasons why we realized that there was a replication issue is because researchers who were trying to develop cancer interventions were going to cancer researchers saying, hey, I can't even develop this intervention because I can't even replicate your initial finding. And so this is sort of I would love to come on and Shane, we could find like some other guests to talk about the very fascinating history of like the replication crisis. But, you know, essentially seeing that these findings aren't replicating has caused psychologists to engage in some soul searching. Why is it that, you know, we're sort of canonizing these things as truth, despite the fact that we can't replicate them? And why is it taking us so long to realize that we can't replicate it? That Penn and Mauss study was published in 1988. It's been a textbook psychological phenomenon until 2016, when 17 labs failed to replicate it. Why did it take almost 40 years for us to realize that it wasn't as replicable as we thought it was? And so this is sort of causing, you know, like a methodological renaissance in psychology. And maybe this is sort of a topic for another time when I'm on, Shane, but one of the things that we're trying to do to address this is build a science that's more committed to rigor and more committed to collaboration. And so Shane mentioned the accelerator. I direct a group called the Psychological Science Accelerator. We're globally distributed networks of labs that pool together our intellectual and material resources to try to accelerate the discovery of reliable knowledge in psychology, knowing that if we want to claim the existence of an effect, that we need to replicate it across multiple sites, and that we need to use extremely rigorous practices so that we know we're not fooling ourselves, and that we know that hopefully 10, 20, 40 years down the line, other people will be able to replicate the results quite cleanly. And so this network is about 1,200 researchers from 82 countries, and we run, you know, the largest studies done in social and cognitive psychology. And we do this in the name of trying to increase the rigor of science because, you know, many of us have witnessed this replication crisis, and we want to build a better science.
How? So here's something about the nitty gritty of science that I definitely know nothing about. Is it difficult to get funding to replicate study? I would think that would be a challenge. Because I would think from someone, you know, deciding on what grant to approve, they kind of, why give, you know, this would be a misunderstanding, but why give money to something that's already known? You know, if that's the point of view, it sort of kind of feels that way sometimes. Oh yeah. You know, so is that part of the issue?
You know, you're spot on. There's a few, you know, it's probably a complicated issue like most things and with humans are, but the lack of funding is a huge one for the reason that you're mentioning there. There's also this idea that journals are not as interested in publishing those results. And so we have to remember that academic journals, you know, they're gatekeepers. And so one of the concerns is that people, for instance, had been failing to replicate things like the effect of power posing on cortisol levels. But then when they submitted their work to journals were like, yeah, but this isn't exciting. And you can't explain why those other researchers were able to get this effect and you weren't. And so there's, you know, probably many factors, but some of the ones that have been pointed out is maybe scientific journals weren't as interested in publishing these results because, you know, not finding an effect is always inconclusive. And so, you know, they might say like, go do more research, or I don't know, like maybe readers don't want to read about this. And then, yeah, there's no funding for it. So if you're not getting the funding for the research and you're not publishing in the journals, you're not getting a job in academia. And so
today's top story, no effects found.
Yeah, right. So
you formed a whole global collaborative trying to find a bunch of no effects, basically.
Well, so
I know that's not what I'm being silly, but
yeah, so we're definitely
it would in your position it would be kind of exciting to find non-effect when there was previously an effect found.
Yeah, we have done that in some of our projects for sure. I'm trying to think of which ones I can talk about, because sometimes journals don't allow us to talk about results until they're published. So I guess I'll just leave this for the next conversation. Of there are plenty of pieces of science that people thought were really solid and that we're having difficulty replicating. And I would say, sometimes we are in the business of doing replications. Oftentimes we're also in the business of doing a new study. And so in the midst of COVID, for instance, we called upon a lot of researchers and we said, give us your best idea. We're going to run some global studies on COVID. Let's find some of the best, studies that we can run on the psychology of COVID. And some of these were replications. Many of them were completely novel tests that we then ran on a global sample of humans to sort of see like what's going on in people, what's the psychology of COVID, what's going on. And so we're in the business of, seeing if things can replicate, but we're also in the business of, trying to discover new truths about the world, but ones that are hopefully more reliable and valid than ones that came before them.
Interesting. Well, yeah, that's we'll have to do a whole episode on that one of these days. Well,
if the listeners are interested.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, it doesn't. I'm interested, so that's all that really matters.
And I'll listen to that episode, Shane. So we have 2 listeners. That's all we need.
Sometimes there's things that I know that are important for me to learn more about that I also recognize may not be the sexiest topics in the world, and I don't always. I'm not saying that's just an example of that, but I don't shy away from learning something because I think it's not going to be as exciting for public consumption or whatever, because otherwise I'd just be watching TV shows and commenting on them.
Yeah. I think that's a great approach. And I think it will be a really exciting topic to explore with the listeners.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for everything. Oh my gosh. This is like almost a 4.5 hour endeavor that we went on today to record this, with all the technical issues and getting locked in a bathroom.
Let's see if it's actually recorded. Maybe we didn't record it. Maybe this is our first take.
As soon as you said that, I was like, no, we recorded this though. But that's, and Nicholas pointed out that if you're going to be locked somewhere in a bathroom, it's not bad. There's water that you can drink. You can shower. You can use the bathroom still. There's not food on there, but you're good for a few days locked in a bathroom.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, what a weird day. And thank you so much for joining me, Nicholas Coles, everybody. And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you more next week.